Hello, my name is Louis Carlet. I'm an organizer and the Chief Finance Officer of Tozen Union. We are here in the headquarters office of Tozen Union in Tokyo, Japan. Today, we're going to talk about Abe's workplace reforms. Shinzo Abe is the Prime Minister of Japan, and last year he and the Japanese Diet passed several reforms to labor law in Japan. Before I start, I'd like to explain a little bit about Tozen Union. Tozen Union was founded in 2010. We are a multinational union devoted to internal democracy, transparency, and fighting for better conditions. Tozen Union strikes more than any union in Japan. Okay, so let's get started. Now, first of all, I'd like to apologize because originally Tozen Union President Hifumi Okunuki was scheduled to give this lecture today. However, she fell ill and she cannot do the lecture today, so I am taking over for her just for today. Okay, so let's start with a broad survey of how workplace reforms, which workplace reforms were passed and how they will affect working conditions in Japan. Now, as far as background goes, in Japan with a shrinking population and more workers working on irregular and precarious contracts, there was a very strong sense that major changes to labor law were needed. Now, both labor and management and the government, well, management and government are kind of very closely linked. Both sides saw the need for these changes. So what happened a few years ago was Prime Minister Abe and the ruling Liberal Democratic Party devised many reforms to labor law, affecting many labor laws. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on the key labor law, which is the Labor Standards Act, or in Japanese, Ro-Kiho. Okay, so the major reforms affected, first of all, overtime, paid leave, and parity between part-time and full-time workers. So I'm going to go through each of these categories and explain in detail what the changes were. Now, as I do that, I'm going to give you, first of all, the claimed purpose and benefits of the change. And then I'm going to tell you my opinion about what is really happening and the actual impact that we can expect and in some cases have already seen. Okay, first of all, let's talk about overtime. Now, in Japan, under Labor Standards Act, there are very clear limits set to how many hours of a day an employee can work. First of all, the limit is 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. These are very strict limits. In principle, an employer cannot make their workers work more than 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. However, since Labor Standards Act was enacted in 1947, there was one exception that was stipulated in Article 36. Now, what this article says is that in a certain exceptional case, the employer can have their workers work more than 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. However, the condition is that the employer must sign an agreement called a Roshi Kyote with a representative of a majority of the employees. So the employee rep or the majority rep and management sign a special deal based on Article 36. This Article 36 agreement enables this overtime pay. Now, of course, when there's overtime work, the employer must pay overtime pay. And there's a formula for how much they must pay. It's not just the same pay per hour. So in general, overtime is paid at time and a quarter, or 1.25 times the rate of the normal hours of that employee. So even when there is an Article 36 agreement and the employee does work overtime, the employer must pay that extra rate. However, the reality in Japan is often they don't pay. And so there's a huge problem with unpaid overtime. Now, part of the background to this is that in Japan, workers famously or infamously work very, very long hours. So there's cases of people working 100 or even 200 hours of overtime per month. And basically their lives are completely devoted to the company. They go home very late, sleep a little bit, get up, come back to work. So this has become more and more a serious problem. And in fact, many workers work to the point of dropping dead, or in some cases killing themselves, because of the incredible stress and pressure and the fact that they're always exhausted. And so there were many calls to do something about this. So what the government said, what the Liberal Democratic Party and particularly Prime Minister Abe said, is that, okay, so we're going to put a limit to how much overtime work can be done. Now, before this new change, there was no limit to how much overtime could be done if you have the Article 36 agreement. Now, there was a guideline, and the guideline was 45 hours a month. But the law didn't say you couldn't go beyond that. It was just like you shouldn't really go over 45 hours a month. However, many companies had Article 36 agreements with 80 hours a month or 100 hours a month or even 200 hours a month. And as long as it was in that Article 36 agreement, they could have their workers work these incredible long hours. So what the government did was, okay, we're going to put the first ever limit, a legal limit on how much time, how much overtime you can ask your employees to do. So there was a lot of debate about this. The Japan Business Federation, called Keidanren, of course, opposed any limit, or if there was a limit, they wanted a very high limit. And on the other hand, labor, particularly Rengo, the major labor federation, called for a lower limit, although they did agree that, I'll go back to that in a second. So basically, the government and Keidanren, representing business in Japan, decided that they would put a limit of 100 hours a month. Okay, now if you think about that, that's about 25 hours a week. And what's interesting about this number, interesting or outrageous, is that 80 hours a month is considered by the Ministry of Labor to be the line where death from overwork, called karoshi, is a real possibility. So 80 hours a month overtime is kind of considered very dangerous. And 100 hours a month is considered basically the line where you will die from overwork. And again, the word karoshi, many countries around the world are familiar with that word because it's such an infamous reality in the Japanese workplace. So the fact that they put the limit, okay, on the one hand, it's great that they put a limit because there never was such a limit. On the other hand, the fact that they place it at 100 hours a month is kind of outrageous if you consider that that's the line where you have a very real possibility of dying from overwork. Now, to be clear, employers still cannot have their workers work 100 hours every month. So what the law actually says, and this law went into effect last April, is that in principle, the limit for overtime is 45 hours a month. Now remember, that was a guideline before. Now that's now the law. Okay, so that's fine for now. However, if the company is particularly busy, and of course companies, of course, are all going to say they're very busy, for up to 6 months, they can have their workers work up to 80 hours a month. And within that 6 months, they can choose 1 month to have their employees work 100 hours a month. Okay, so to recap, in principle, it's 45 hours every month. For up to 6 months, workers can work up to 80 hours. And for 1 month of those 6 months, they can make their workers work 100 hours a month. Okay, now, of course, to have any overtime at all, the company still must sign an Article 36 agreement with the employee rep. Okay, so many unions around Japan, of course, protested this incredibly high cap on overtime work hours. However, Rengo agreed to it. And again, Rengo is the major labor federation in Japan. Full disclosure, Tozen Union is a member of Rengo Tokyo. So they actually went along with it as what they said was a first step. Now, in my opinion, it could be a first step, but it could also be a first step in the wrong direction. Like right now, every month is 45 hours, with exceptions up to 80 hours and up to 100 hours. However, you can easily imagine business pressuring management to make 80 hours or 100 hours a new norm. You know, when government and management want to make major changes, they often start with small steps and then go further and further and further. And we'll see that later with the new white collar exemption, which I will discuss a little bit later. Okay, so later we'll be taking questions and answers after my lecture. So if you have questions about any of these topics, please send them in if you're on live stream. And if you're here, of course, you can just ask them directly. Now, next, I would like to discuss annual paid leave. Okay, now the annual paid leave system in Japan works as follows. After 6 months of employment, if you work 5 days a week, you are entitled to take 10 paid annual leave. These are what are often called personal days. And you can take them freely when you want over the next 2 years. Now, if you don't take them after 2 years, you lose them. That's the system as it is now. And then each year, like the next year, you get 11 days, then 12 days, and it slowly goes up until a maximum of 20 days. And you get these tranches of paid leave each year. And then you have 2 years to take them. So you can build up quite a number. Although if you don't use them within 2 years, you just lose them. So it's kind of use them or lose them when it comes to annual paid leave. However, in Labor Standards Act, and this is even before the reforms, there was an exception, always an exception that helps management. In this case, the exception was if management signed an Article 39 agreement, remember the last one was 36, this one's 39, if they signed an Article 39 agreement with the employee majority rep, the company could decide many of the days that you have as paid leave. So in other words, if you have 10 paid leave days, management can designate 5 of them. Now, they always have to leave you 5 to take freely. So if you've built up to, let's say, 20 days, they can designate 15 of them, but they must leave 5 of them freely. So, of course, this exception is bad because management can basically control the workers when they take their paid leave. Without this agreement, the workers are free to take all of them whenever they want. It's an incredible right for workers to be able to deal with things that come up in their lives, with illness, with, if they want to take a vacation or just chill out. So the fact that there even is this Article 39 exception, of course, is not good for workers. Now, the idea is, well, the workers agreed to it because they elect an employee representative, and that employee representative said, okay, you can designate most of our paid holidays. However, the reality is, at most workplaces, management doesn't really explain to the employees that they have a right to refuse. They kind of present the document as if it's just something they have to sign. Now, here, sign this. They often don't have proper elections for employee rep. they often just designate who the employee rep is and then ask them to sign it, as if it's just a bureaucratic thing that has to be handled. So there's already abuse of the system, and most people could only take 5 days of paid leave. And of course, Japan, in addition to overtime work, another issue in Japan is that many people don't even take the paid holidays that they have. And so they might be getting 20 days a year, and even without the Article 39 agreement, they just don't take the days that they have because there's this social pressure that everyone else is working and I'm going off and having fun at the beach or something like that. So often companies don't even bother with the Article 39 agreement because they know the employees won't really take paid holiday unless there's a really serious emergency or someone in their family passes away. And so it's already a bad situation. However, when the new laws that I'm about to explain, when they were passed, the average number of days that workers actually took as paid leave was slightly over 5. Okay, now think about that. So they were actually taking 5 of the 10 or 5 of the 11, 5 of the 12. Each year they were taking 5 paid holidays. It's better than 0, but they weren't taking their full allotment for sure, even when there was no Article 39 agreement. So what the government said, what the government claimed is, okay, we have this problem. Japanese workers don't take their paid leave like they should. And of course, Japan, other countries were kind of aware of that. And, why do Japanese work so hard? And okay, why don't we force them to take the paid leave? Then no matter what happens, they'll at least take them. So what did they do? They said, okay, with the new workplace reforms, the new law, again in Labor Standards Act, says management must force their employees to take at least 5 of their paid holidays. Now, this is a really bizarre thing. Remember, they're already taking 5 days on average. And of course, government and business surely knew this. But now they have this law to make them take 5 paid holidays. Okay, well, of course, it's good that workers take paid holidays. And so my first idea was, okay, well, when can they make them take the paid holidays? Now, my thought when it first came out was, okay, so let's say you work at a company for 6 months and you get 10 paid holidays. Okay, and let's say you don't take any paid holidays for the 2 years because you feel that pressure that you have to go to work every day. And then after the 2 years, when you lose them, then management can make you take 5 of those paid holidays. That was what I thought. That's what I imagined. Or maybe not after you lose them, but the last 5 days they can make you take them. And that would be reasonable because then, the worker didn't make use of the right to paid holidays. And so then they have to take them. So at least they're taking off. But that's not what the law says. The law doesn't say when the company has to make you take the paid leave. So the reality is management could theoretically, and I imagine this is going to happen, they could make you take the paid holidays, at least 5 of them, before you lose them. So in other words, as soon as you get the paid holidays, let's say a month later, they could make you take the 5 paid holidays. Now, why do I say this? Why is that a problem? The problem is basically this new law gives management permission to designate the other 5 days that they could not designate up until now. So this is actually an attack on employees and workers because before, at least they could take 5 days freely. Now, even those 5 days, management could, if they wanted to, force you to take them before you even lose them. And then if they have an Article 39 agreement to designate all the other days, then it turns out you can't take any paid holidays freely. And I suspect that might be the purpose because, again, the average number of days that workers took was already 5, in fact, slightly over 5. So it's odd that the government would say, we're going to make employers make you take 5 paid holidays. Okay. So, and again, if you're watching live stream or if you're here, when we get to the Q&A, please feel free to send your questions in and we'll tackle them at that time. Okay, next thing I'd like to talk about is parity. Now, the issue of parity is that over the years, more and more workers are working on contingent, irregular employment. Now, what that means is that they are on fixed-term contracts or part-time or of course, day laborers, dispatch workers. Traditionally, during the rapid economic growth in the post-war, workers worked full-time employment, open-ended contracts. Jobs were very secure. It was very hard to fire anybody. And they were committed to the company, and the company basically was committed to them, and employers felt a huge responsibility. Since the late 80s and 90s and increasing deregulation, the number of irregular workers, like fixed term, part-time, dispatch, and other, has increased more and more and more, to the point where now almost 40% of workers are on irregular employment. For women, it's a majority, and for foreigners, it's over 90%. So I'd say it's between 30 and 40% overall for workers. I don't have the exact number on me right now. So as this has increased, of course, jobs have become less and less secure, income has become less and less secure, and it's led to serious problems of poverty in Japan. Even though it's a very rich country, there's more and more poverty, more insecurity. And when you're on a fixed-term contract, it's much more difficult to complain to management or to demand anything from management. It's much more difficult to unionize, because if you're on a fixed-term employment, at the end of the contract, that's it. You have no rights. Management has no obligation to renew your contract in most cases. If you're on permanent employment, it's hard for management to fire you. If you're on a fixed-term contract, all they have to do is wait till the end of the contract. At least that's how management sees the situation. So with all this increased insecurity, there have been calls to do something about it. So even before Abe's workplace reforms, labor contract law, Article 18, was introduced in order to give those on fixed-term contracts, on temporary contracts, a way to convert to permanent employment. And the way they did that was, they said, okay, if you work more than 5 years on fixed-term contracts, you can convert yourself into permanent. Because the problem was that employers were just putting people on one-year contracts over and over and over again, revolving them every year, renewing the contract, but you're always in this precarious position. And management was abusing the situation by constantly revolving, and renewing, and keeping you forever in this temporary position. So basically, what was called in the United States permatemps. So the new rule, this was before the workplace reforms, so I don't want to confuse anyone there. So the new rule was that if you work more than 5 years, you can convert yourself to permanent status. Now that sounds really good. It sounds like, oh wow, it's going to increase job security. It didn't, and it wouldn't. If you think about it, first of all, the new law was not grandfathered. So it didn't say if you've already been on 5 years, more than 5 years employment, you can convert. It said, okay, the clock starts now. And so what happened is, before 5 years was up, after the law went into effect, many companies said, okay, we got to get rid of our temporary employees, otherwise they're going to convert to permanent status. And oh my God, we won't be able to fire them whenever we feel like it. So many companies started non-renewing, what we at Tozen Union call firing. They started non-renewing their fixed-term employees in order to avoid the 5-year rule kicking in. And then what did they do? Then they hired more temporary employees, but with a clearly stipulated limit. You can be renewed, but up until 5 years. So basically, what the effect of this law, at least I don't have very good data about this, but what we have seen is that it has decreased job security, not increased. Okay, so another thing that was done in that law was say that if you're on fixed term employment and you're doing the same job as someone on permanent status, you can't discriminate unless there's a very good reason for it. There has to be a very logical reason. And this was put into effect also with the workplace reforms. The idea that there must be parity. If you're doing the same work, you should be getting the same pay. And the same work, same pay is one of the major provisions among these workplace reforms. The problem here is that it has to be the same work, same pay. So even if you're in fixed term contract, however, it's a very easy task for employers, for companies to say, oh, this is not exactly the same. You put a couple words different in the work duties, and all you have to do is that, and you can say, okay, it's the same pay. I'm sorry, it's not the same pay, it's a different work, so it doesn't have to be the same pay. Another problem is that there was this great awareness that those on permanent status, regular employment, had much higher pay than those on irregular, contingent work. So we had to do something about this disparity. It was leading to income disparity. It was leading to friction at the workplace. So of course, from our point of view, you should bring the part-time worker or the fixed-term workers up to the level of permanent employers. But of course, that's not what management thinks. Management clearly thinks that maybe we can lower the conditions of permanent staff and keep temporary staff the same, or maybe lower one and raise the other. So again, overall, this is again something that looks like it's good for workers, but actually turns out to be good for employers. And that's why Abe and Keidanren, the Japan Business Federation, that's why they push these things through. Okay. So it's a little earlier than usual because we were planning on having interpreting, and what we will do is have subtitles for this. We will put Japanese subtitles for this video. However, I just want to stress one more time that the main problem of these reforms is that they all look really good, at least for workers. But if you look at the details, and if you look at the actual effects that we predicted, you see that the reforms are not really reforms that make things better. They're reforms that only help management and lower conditions for workers in many different ways. So I know it's very early and quick, but that's all I have to say. So I'll take questions now. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jerome Rothman. I also am an organizer of Tozen Union. Thanks for the overview. Despite being thrown into this the last minute, I think that very informative. I do have one question.
Sure.
So you've been an organizer in Japan for what now, 15 years?
Yeah, excuse me. Can I have that water? Sorry. Yes.
Marco Rubio thing here?
Yeah, 17 years, yeah.
So,
excuse me, I'm going to drink this water.
So how long has it been?
17 years.
So what, in your opinion, would be a real Hataraki Kaitan? If they were going to do a real bill to reform labor law.
That's a good question. So let me go through real quickly. First of all, I think one thing they could have done is have a strict 45-hour limit for overtime. No exceptions. Or even lower. Or say start with 45 and then, over the years we'll lower it even down to more. I mean, personally, I think Article 36 should be abolished. There should be no exceptions. Workers throughout the last century or so have, given their sweat and blood and tears to fight for the 40-hour work week. And yet we're losing it before our eyes. It's supposed to be 40 hours. That's supposed to be the limit of work. There should be no reason for this exception. I mean, of course, in cases of, someone's life is at stake or something like that, I understand. But there should not be this exception that becomes normalized. Almost every major company has an Article 36 agreement. It's supposed to be one exception. So abolishing 36 would be great in my eyes, because then we get back to the 40-hour week, which workers around the world fought so hard for. That's one thing. Okay, the next thing about paid holidays, I think they should get rid of Article 39, which makes an exception for workers freely taking paid holidays. It's important to remember that basically management holds all the cards. They have much more economic and social power, and the fact that workers in Labor Standards Act can take their paid holidays freely is a really important device to slightly correct that balance of power. So I think Article 39 takes it away. So many of these laws that protect workers have a little exception that helps management. And of course, management quickly finds that exception and they all use it. So it's not even an exception anymore. It's just it becomes normalized. So for instance, in the 5-year rule that I talked about, that was before the workplace reforms. When you convert to permanent, the law says it has to be your current conditions. And so basically, when you convert, they can't just change everything and make it not attractive to you. But there's a little tiny phrase that says, unless it's stipulated elsewhere. So of course, that little tiny exception, management jumps on. And then I know one case, I've had a consultation with a woman who said they cut her pay by 1/3 because they had a little stipulation in their work rules that if you become permanent, we'll cut your pay by 1/3. So these little exceptions, they look innocuous. And if workers and unions don't look carefully, they're going to actually believe, oh my God, this is a great thing. Oh my God, we can all be permanent. But it's not really true. It's important to find those exceptions. So of course, those exceptions should not be there. That's one thing for the 5-year rule. Secondly, my idea is that there should be no fixed term employment except for fixed term jobs. So if you're an actor in a movie, let's say, right? You're the star in a movie, and the movie takes a year to produce. That would be legitimate for a 1-year contract, because the movie's not going to be produced for 30 years until you retire. So to me, if it's fixed term work, if there's a really legitimate reason to be on a fixed term contract, then that should be allowed. Otherwise, the standard permanent employment should be required, in my opinion. So that to me would be a great reform. I would love to see that. What was the other thing? So if we did a lot of that, you wouldn't even need the parity laws between irregular and regular employment. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'd like to tell whoever's on live stream, if anybody, this is our first time for live stream Tozen Daigaku, so there's a little bumps and like that. So we're just finding our way. So please bear with us. So any other questions?
Not every question is a softball like the one I just did.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It's all about the fixed term contracts.
Mhm.
But what do you think about the probation period? What do you think?
Yeah. Okay.
How long should it be?
Well, okay. So probation in Japan, there's no legal minimum or maximum. The law says very little about probation periods. However, many companies put in their contracts the first 1 month or 2 months is probation. Now, even if it's during probation, they still need a legitimate reason to fire somebody, even during probation. And we have a lot of cases like that where someone's fired during probation. And management likes to think, well, it's just probation, so I don't have to continue their employment, which is not really true. However, probation is something that's good for management. I mean, it's just a fact. It's good for them and it's not good for the employee. So I would prefer that there is no probation, that management hires someone, they're employed. If there are problems, there are many ways to deal with problems. Not everyone's, not every worker is going to be equally talented or equally hardworking. But I think it's important that dismissal should not be a way to resolve problems at the workplace. In my mind, and I think many unions' minds, employment should be stable. If there's problems, people work together to fix them. So that's my opinion. Any other questions?
One more.
Sure.
You talked about paid leave, but what do you think about paid leave being linked to actual worked hours? So you build up the paid leave on the amount of hours you work. So overtime also gives you working.
Yeah, I've never thought of that. That's interesting. As it is now, it depends on, like, if you work 6 months, how many days per week? Like, if you work 5 days a week, after 6 months is 10 days. But if you work 4 days or 3 days, it's less. That's interesting. To be honest, I've never thought about that. Is that how it is in some European countries, or?
Yeah.
So if you work more hours, you get more paid leave. That's interesting. Yeah. It sounds good. I
You
mean,
build it up. So if you work a lot of overtime, then
yeah.
it eventually will cost you to take a lot of leave also.
It sounds okay. However, I think people work too much anyway. So I'm a little resistant to incentivizing overtime. I think, except for extraordinary circumstances, I think people shouldn't be working more than 40 hours a week anyway. I think we're too obsessed with work and with productivity and stuff like that. So. Any questions from online? Is anybody watching? Oh, okay.
I do the 4 people, not us.
What?
So 3 people.
Okay, so we finish it? Okay, if you have questions, of course, you can send us questions and we'll deal with it. And of course, if you're interested in Tozen Union, please contact us. And so, signing out. And next month is.
Oh, yeah.
Have we signed up?
Sorry, have we signed out?
No.
We're still streaming?
No, we can.
Yeah, we'll have it right now.
Yeah.
What's the next one? March is.
I got it. Hold on.
Just tell me the date and what it's about.
Yeah. So it looks like it is March 22nd.
March
at 2 o'clock,
22nd at 2 p.m.
About the 5-year rule.
About the 5-year rule that I mentioned today.
And that's
I'll go into more detail about that.
Superstar attorney.
Is that? Oh, that's not me. It's Ibuski.
Yes.
Yeah. So it won't be me. It'll be our superstar attorney Shoichi Ibuski, and he's really funny. People like his lectures. I'll probably be interpreting. So I'll see you next month. Oh, did you turn it off?